Hello, I'm Peter Murray. I'm Curator-in-Chief at NLA.
And I'm Stuart Baillie. I'm Head of Planning at Knight Frank and partnering the NLA with the research this year.
Can you just give me a rundown of the figures for this year?
Yeah, absolutely, Peter. So we have seen a slight decline in the overall pipeline this year. So we're down from 541 tall buildings down to 525. So a slight reduction. Part of that is reflected by a significant spike in the number of completions in 2019. So there was 60 tall buildings completed last year. We are seeing a bit of a slowdown in construction starts in the overall monitoring. We're still seeing the majority of the pipeline being dominated by residential, the vast majority, and there's 110,000 homes potentially coming through that pipeline. But we have seen a little bit of an increase in the planning applications side and the commercial side of things as well, so office development and other sides. A really interesting thing in this year's pipeline has been a continued growth in outer London, which we've seen the proportion of the pipeline now stands at 35% in outer London boroughs.
You say there's a slowdown in starts. Why is that?
There's a number of reasons behind that. Obviously, the Brexit considerations last year did have implications on the time it's taking to assemble the labour and the materials for sites. So we've seen that having an impact. We're also seeing some schemes taking longer to get through the planning process, although we've seen a 7% rise in the number of planning permissions. So on one hand, it's showing that boroughs seem to be more accepting of tall buildings, but perhaps giving it a tougher time through the planning process. And the construction timeline is also taking longer. So we've gone from 2.5 years on average to go through planning to construction completion to 3 years, assessing last year's figures. So that is obviously taking into consideration the amount of time and the expense of going through the construction process.
You've calculated that tall buildings deliver some 110,000 new homes in London. Do we know how many of those are affordable?
It's difficult to look at that for the whole pipeline because obviously the affordable doesn't get set until it's actually seeing development on the ground and being occupied. But what we have been able to do is look at the completed schemes, the 60 completed schemes this year, and about 21% of that is affordable. So I think when we look at that in the context of Mayor Khan's sort of firmer stance on affordable and trying to drive that up to minimum 35%, that will probably come through in subsequent years in terms of that analysis. But 21% seems to be where we are in those completed schemes.
You say we're seeing a growth of towers in outer London, continuing growth of towers in outer London. What is it that's driving that?
It's been really interesting. We started to see it obviously last year with a significant gain in outer London, and we've seen it again this year. And I think that there's a number of factors there. Land value comes into it, so cheaper sites to assemble, and transport improvements is obviously coming into that as well with Crossrail and other transport improvements. But really, we're seeing definitely the mayor's opportunity areas are having an impact here, and some of the newer opportunity areas that have been designated in outer London. I mean, we're seeing every boroughs such as Ealing and sort of Old Oak Common, North Acton, and Southall being particular sort of clusters and spikes for tall buildings. Greenwich has always been in the pipeline. It's always been a strong sort of component of the pipeline, but seeing Woolwich probably the first time really starting to feature as an area or a cluster again, coming through in sort of more of an outer London context. And then Haringey would be the other borough. So the three boroughs, Ealing, Greenwich and Haringey in particular around Tottenham Hale. So those factors I think are combining to see that growth in outer London, and obviously the expertise within the boroughs probably getting more used to dealing with those sorts of applications, and the appetite, the housing need is a key factor behind that as well.
We're in quite an interesting period at the moment, aren't we, when the Mayor and the Secretary of State for Housing, Communities and Local Government, they're disagreeing on the London plan. And the London plan itself gives greater responsibilities to the local boroughs to decide where they should put their tall buildings, while the Secretary of State is looking for what he calls gentle density, by which I think he means more mansion blocks rather than tower blocks. How do you think that's going to play out as we get back to hopefully normality?
It's another interesting point, and it's obviously been well documented that the Secretary of State has become involved with the London plan. The rationale to delivering the housing numbers in the scale that's required for London means that the tall buildings agenda is still going to be part of that answer to housing requirements. There definitely is a drive towards better design, and that's echoed both in City Hall and in Whitehall. So I think we will see more focus on design as part of that solution. But it's definitely that drive to encourage boroughs to take a more robust approach to actually identifying what is acceptable, what heights are acceptable, what is a tall building in that borough's context, and obviously the impact on character. And we're aware of a number of boroughs now looking at the character of their areas and trying to sort of pin that down a bit further. It takes some expertise to do that, and I think pushing that to sort of front loading it to the sort of policy development stage is an interesting one. We hope that won't slow down the sort of process of allowing development to flow, whether that's tall buildings or mansion blocks or whatever the mixture of development might be.
The difference between the two is quite stark, isn't it? Particularly if you look at the green belt, where Sadiq Khan wants to protect the green belt, while the Secretary of State is keen to have a review of the green belt, which might mean it being used for development a little bit more. So do we have to choose between building up or building out?
It's a great question and always difficult to answer, but essentially I think the supply of land at the moment, if you just purely look, if you take the green belt out of the equation, as is the case currently, the supply of land is not delivering the amount of housing that London needs. And there's obviously pressure from other land uses as well for land in London, whether that's logistics, employment, office space as well. So I think it's a real difficulty. You can't just achieve it through brownfield alone. And yes, the Mayor got into a bit of a pickle with the small sites requirements, and small sites will come through, but perhaps not in the volume that was predicted, and that's something the Secretary of State did have a bit of an issue with. That looking ahead piece, I think the green belt needs to be factored into that, and how that's done and who does it is a big challenge and a big question. And whether the Mayor leads that, it's going to be a difficult one for him to take on politically. But it's obviously a combination between London boroughs and the southeast outer-lying home counties boroughs as well. So it's got to be a conversation that happens.
In the aftermath of Grenfell Tower fire, we've now got thinking about the implications of COVID-19 and, of course, at some stage, Brexit too. What impact are those three factors coming together going to have on delivery of tall buildings in the future?
We at Knight Frank started 2020 in a position of optimism, I would say. We sort of came into it following some difficulties across the market in 2019, really Brexit-related uncertainty, political uncertainty, and the elections at the back end of 2019 and the sort of the relative security of a London mayor that's probably going to serve another term. I think we started the year all fairly confident the development industry was going to come in quite strongly, and nobody was predicting coronavirus. We've obviously seen the details of the Grenfell inquiries coming out, and there's going to be a huge amount more to be done. The regulations have been tightened up significantly in terms of development, and that's inevitably going to lead to higher costs for these types of development. Safety is going to be paramount in that regard. So a combination of that and planning policies that were mooted to be changed, COVID-19 really biting. There may be a bit of a delay in some of that now, but the combination of these things means that the schemes are going to have to be very well thought through. And yes, there'll be some increased costs, but I think setting aside COVID-19 being hopefully a short-term impact in terms of the lockdown that we're currently facing, there's likely to be some impact on supply chain, there's likely to be some impact on labour, there's likely to be a staggered return to constructions on site, depending on the developers. But from what we're hearing in the market in particular, there's an appetite to invest still that's there. There's a sort of latent demand that's been built up, and that investment that was there to be spent in January, some of it may be diverted, of course, but there's certainly a willingness to invest in the UK, and that's both in the UK market itself and also overseas market. But I think we'll only really see the full truth of that when we know when the restrictions are lifted and what that impacts in the longer term. But I do think, the requirement for housing still exists massively. The demand for new office space was really coming to the fore in the first quarter of the year, before we got sort of stuck into the coronavirus considerations. So the combination of those things, I do think there's going to be a return of the market quite swiftly after we're clear of COVID-19. The question is, will attitudes change, I suppose, and will attitudes to types of development change? And I don't think we'll see the implications of that until we're sort of moving forward into 2021 and beyond.
Thank you, Stuart, and thank you to Knight Frank for providing this really important research. The NLA started looking into tall buildings and their impact on London back in 2014. We've done an annual report each year since, and we feel it's really important that Londoners, planners, and all those involved in the built environment really understand what the impact of new development like this is on the city. And the research that you've done for us is very helpful in providing a very clear picture of what is happening to London at the present time. So thank you very much indeed.
Thank you, Peter.